and hospice chaplain for 14 years. And before she was a hospice chaplain, she served 2 years as a hospital chaplain, where she received 9 CEU credits, or clinical pastoral education credits, which most of you don't know, but chaplains, if they have 1 or 2, that's good. So she's kind of an overachiever. She served as 3 years as a student pastor at Lone Oak United Methodist Church. She has a master's in social work and worked with pre-adolescents for 5 years in an intensive outpatient hospital. She has a master's in divinity from Bright Divinity at Texas Christian University. She's currently going to Chicago Theological Seminary, working on her doctorate of ministry, where her thesis is working on the LGBTQ+ and religious trauma.
Remember how to do all this stuff. I used to know it. All right. On religious trauma, we're going to discuss certain things, and it was a really long talk, and I cut it down, and so it's not as long. So it was 35 slides, and I was like, oh, y'all don't want to do that. So we're not doing 35 slides. Wherever there's a power imbalance, there exists an increased potential to abuse the power in a way that's harmful to the individual with less power. Spiritual abuse and religious trauma are closely related concepts, often overlapping but distinct in how they manifest and affect individuals. Spiritual abuse is a broader term than religious abuse. Religious abuse is more specific, referring to abuse within an organized church or religious group. And they're very overlapping. Abuse is abuse, but when we talk religious, we're talking about the whole institution, and spiritual abuse, we're talking more about the individual receiving that abuse. There's certain spiritual traps that when I was looking at it, I was like, wow, I didn't think about that. But the leader assumes power and demands obedience. They foster loyalty to the organization with implied or overt scare tactics and threats. Leaving the system is equal to leaving God, which I know some of y'all have felt that from other institutions, and that's why we're here, because we don't have that overarching, you're going to go to hell because you've sinned and all of that. So that's the spiritual trap. On spiritual abuse, it's a misuse of power in spiritual contexts in which a person or group uses various cohesive and manipulative methods of controlling the victim, resulting in the abused individual experiencing spiritual, emotional, psychological, physical, or relational harm. And when I talk about relational harm, it's not just what we see from the leader to that person, but it can also be family members that cause this relational harm. It can be, and I actually talk about it here in a minute. I'm going ahead of myself. But spiritual abuse from family members, congregation members, so it's not just from the leader. It can be caused by congregation members and family. Spiritual abuse can also occur when spirituality, which I cannot say, I've never been able to say that word, is used to make others live in a spiritual standard. However, religious abuse is an abuse administered under the guise of religions. It includes harassment, humiliation, mind control, psychological abuse, isolation, threats, intimidation, minimizing, denying, blame, asserting spiritual authority, and making it difficult to leave the religious community. Religious abuse may also include misuse of religion for selfish, secular, sexual, or ideological ends. So again, with religious abuse, we're looking at the whole religion, whereas spiritual is just the identity of the person. Common symptoms of religious trauma: hypervigilance, which means basically you're very hyped. You feel this almost like a PTSD where everything is very hypered in your in your thoughts. And so it's consistent anxiety relating to a feeling that is one always being judged or watched, either by God, the community, or others. So again, we're looking at how are you feeling once you have left the organization or religion, and how are you feeling internally? Depersonalization, or disconnection from one's true self due to forced conformity to religious beliefs. Difficult trusting others, or forming healthy relationships due to the past betrayal of trust in religious leaders or the community. And then it leads to post-traumatic stress, triggered by reminders of past religious abuse or distrusting religious teachings. And here, I'd like to go over some examples of religious trauma. Someone who grew up in a strict religious environment where they were taught that non-believers were doomed to external punishments. And we all know those jokes, oh, if you're not Church of Christ, well, then you're going to go to hell. If you're not Catholic, you're going to go to hell. Well, we've all heard those, but that's an actual religious trauma. An individual raised in a faith that shamed and condemned sexual identity and desires may experience long-term emotional distress, internalized shame, or difficulty forming healthy relationships. And that, again, goes back to that shame base. If you have sex before you're married, then you're going to go to hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. So what are you going to do? Relationship between spiritual abuse and religious trauma. While spiritual abuse is a form of religious trauma itself is a broader category that encompasses various types of harmful religious experiences, including but not limited to spiritual abuse. Spiritual abuse is often the root cause of religious trauma. For instance, a person who experiences spiritual abuse is a high-demand religious group, such as Baptist, Pentecostal. Those have high demand on what you do, very Catholic as well. So that's what a high-demand religious group may be like. May eventually develop broader religious trauma symptoms, including anxiety, depression, identity confusion, and social isolation. Religious trauma can occur even outside the abuse of a spiritual context. For example, someone raised in an authoritarian religious environment where the focus was the strict rules and fear-based teaching may experience trauma even if the leadership wasn't initially manipulative. So again, it goes back to those parents and grandparents. Well, this is how it is, and this is how it's going to be, and so you've got to live in this religion. Religious trauma on the brain. Religious trauma can have profound effects on the brain and mental health, often resulting in psychological and emotional challenges. When someone experiences religious trauma, it usually involves an intense, distressing experience tied to their religious beliefs, practices, or community teachings. The effect can vary, but common brain and psychological impacts. So, how do we deal with this? Fundamental reorganization. Trauma results in a fundamental reorganization of the way mind and brain manage perceptions. It changes not only how we think and what we think about, but also our very capacity to think. So it's pretty intensive. For a real change to take place, the body needs to learn that the danger has passed and to live in the reality of the present, to rethink about processes of the brain and how to heal. So we're going to talk about an adverse religious experience that I didn't realize I had this chart, but we'll go with it. Any experience of a religious belief, practice, or structure that undermines an individual's sense of safety or autonomy or negatively impacts their physical, social, emotional, relational, or psychological well-being. So an adverse religious experience can be that shame base or that fear. Well, if you leave this congregation, you're no longer going to be a part of us. And therefore, I have a fear because if I am not a part of the community, where am I going to belong? When we repeatedly hear negative messages about our own or others' bodies, we internalize these beliefs in our bodies. Words from the pulpit or from influential leaders, including parents, partners, or surrounding culture, about who or how our bodies affect others are taught as absolutes. And I know just coming from the Catholic Church, there were a lot of absolutes, and going to confession was one of those, well, you can get rid of the absolutes, but they don't go away. Safety. So now we're going to go into how do you heal from religious trauma. Recovery unfolds in 3 stages. The central task of the first stage is just to establish safety. How do you feel safe where you are? The central task of the second stage is remembrance and mourning. So you do grieve. You do have that sense of not knowing where your footing is. So you're going to go through a grieving process. The central task of the third stage is reconnection with the ordinary life. So I'm not sure what ordinary life is. One day I'll find it. But there is no test to diagnose spiritual abuse. There are only spiritual clues. Lack of joy in the Christian life, tiredness from trying too hard to measure up, disillusionment about God and spiritual things, uneasiness, lack of trust, or even the fear of those who care about God things. Even legitimately a profound sense of missing your best friend. Have you ever thought about that? When you leave a church, your best friend stays there, you have nothing to talk about anymore. Cynicism or grief over good news that turned out to be too good to be true. All right, growth stages in recovery. After trauma, 3 growth stages emerge: victim, survivor, thriver. The victim stage is marked by enormous suffering. During this first stage, people feel powerless and disconnected. Intense psychological symptoms are dominant in this stage. In the next phase, most victims stop using that word and being called then themselves survivors. This phase is all about recovery. In this phase, right brain memories of the trauma can more easily be transferred into the left brain storage, where logic, storytelling, and mental reasoning live. Emotional memories of the traumatic memories start to make sense rather than overwhelm the survivor. And in the thriver stage, people acknowledge their trauma. They have experienced great pain, but they choose no longer to be defined by it. And thanks for listening. I didn't want to go too long.